All right, trying again for the third time. Okay, so hello, hello. Welcome to my explanation on the HPA axis. Why the HPA axis, considering I have no other videos on this channel? Just because I really like talking about the endocrine system. And I feel like the HPA axis, I really like starting with this when I'm talking to my students. Because I feel like it's a good place to start because you only have three organs in it. Pretty straightforward when it comes to the hormones themselves, and I feel like it's a good place to start to just understand like what's going on, and it allows us to like kind of talk about the different ways that like the hypothalamus can talk to the pituitary and all of that kind of stuff, right? um so basically there's an explanation on the HPA axis. Cool. All right, so before I keep going, what do I mean by the word axis, right? You might see this in a lot of places. Axis just is one of those pathways in the endocrine system. That's what I'm referring to when I say the HPA axis. So, like, what I mean by this is like, you might have the hypothalamus releases something to the pituitary, so let's say it releases CRH to the pituitary. Let's just go with the pathway that we're talking about, right? And the pituitary releases ACTH to the adrenal gland. All right, so that's one, and the adrenal gland like does stress, does stress. I'll talk about exactly what I mean by that. Um, and then you have another axis, right? Like you can have the HPG axis. So this releases, if I release, let's say, let me use a different color. Let's say it releases GnRH to the pituitary. Pituitary then releases, well, a few different things, right? Like you can release FSH to either Sertoli or ovary. And it can also release, right, like LH to the late egg or also the ovary. It's essentially to cause ovulation. Um, But the point being, it's really hard to talk about the entire endocrine system as a whole. Um, so an axis refers to just one of these pathways, right? So that's what I mean when I'm talking about the axis. The HPA axis is also referred to as the stress axis, which you might have garnered from me writing this over here, right? So let's kind of talk about this a little bit. What do I mean by what is H, what is P, what is A, all of that stuff. So you might have figured it out, or you might have already known this, right? H is hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus releases a hormone. The hormone is called CRH. We'll get to that in a second, to the pituitary. Now, this is interesting. I really want to stress that this is the anterior pituitary, right? Not the posterior. And there's a reason we have to talk about it, and I'll get to that. And the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, releases another hormone called ACTH to the adrenal gland, which then releases glucocorticoids. And actually, not mineralocorticoids, there's a whole other system for that. We'll talk about that. Well, if there is. Yeah, glucocorticoids. These glucocorticoids can actually go in and stimulate the medulla, the adrenal medulla. Let me be careful. The adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. So basically, your catecholamines, right? Okay. So these are the key things that I'm going to talk about. There's also another hormone or another category of stress hormones called mineralocorticoids, and these are also corticosteroids. Um, the main one that we have to talk about is aldosterone, but I think aldosterone deserves its own like video, so I'm gonna not do that right now. I'm gonna focus primarily on this guy right here. Okay, so before we get to all of that, right? What the heck's a hormone? So a hormone is a chemical messenger. So that's what any textbook's going to tell you. When you look it up on Google, this is what it's going to tell you. What do I mean by that? Chemical messenger is essentially just it's one way that like two organs can communicate to each other, right? Like it's how the hypothalamus can tell the pituitary what to do. It's how the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release TSH, so thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's how the pituitary then stimulates the thyroid to release all the thyroid hormones, right? Um, so yeah, so a hormone is a chemical messenger. Um, mm, 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 mm. Okay, if it's a chemical messenger, right, that often means that it's a ligand. What does that mean? So when this hormone, right, it finally, so let's say the hypothalamus releases this hormone CRH, right, into the blood. Then CRH synapses onto a receptor, and this receptor is going to be in the anterior pituitary. Let me not use an actual hormone here. I'm just going to say hormone H, right? And this is in the anterior pituitary. Now, this is where you have GPCRs, right? Like you have G protein coupled receptors. And GPCRs are any kind of like ligand gated channel, really. So anything that's ligand gated, it often tends to be GPCRs, but not always. So this ligand, so a ligand is essentially something that synapses onto a receptor. So this ligand causes some kind of, somehow like causes a channel to open up. You have a influx of sodium, right? And that is then gonna cause the cell to have an action potential, right? And when it has an action potential, that is basically stimulating. So basically, at the end of the day, these hormones are gonna help like depolarize the cell, and that's gonna like cause it to do whatever it has to do next. That's essentially how these hormones work. It can also work the other way, right? Like you can also inhibit it, and what inhibit means is it essentially hyperpolarizes the cell. So the two words that if you don't understand what I just said, these are pretty key points in neuro. So if you don't understand what I just said, I would first, right now, just look up what they are. And then second, I'll link some videos in the description that I think will be good to watch if you don't understand these words, because they're pretty important in terms of like the nervous system. So I think for those of you using Kaplan, I think that's the chapter actually right before this one. So would be important to understand. Or right after. Anyway, okay, so um, that's how a hormone works. So the first hormone, the hypothalamus releases a hormone into the blood for the pituitary. Now, how does that work, right? Like, does it just release it into the blood? The blood then like goes all the way through the heart. Like, does every cell receive this blood with a heightened amount of CRH? No. So, the hypothalamus, it actually releases CRH into the portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, the hypophyseal portal. Okay, what does that mean? This might be throwing you off. Whenever you see this word hypophyses, oh, hypophyses, or hypophysis, this is just an old name for the not the adrenal, oh my God, for the pituitary. All right. So this is a portal system for the pituitary, and it essentially allows the hypothalamus to directly communicate with the pituitary through the blood, right? Otherwise, if we didn't have the system, right, the way like blood normally circulates in the body, right? So it's going to go from the hypothalamus. So the heart's pumped some blood to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has then, it sends it back to the heart once it's deoxygenated, right? Heart goes to lungs, and like the blood from the heart goes to the lungs, and comes back to the heart, and then that then goes to the pituitary. By this time, there's gonna be a lot of processing that's happened, and really, it's too long, right? Like the hypothalamus needs to act fast, so this is way too long of a process. Instead, it's just going to release the CRH, the CRH, the hormone, into the portal system. So the portal really just allows it. It's just like a singular duct between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, right? Now, why do I keep saying anterior pituitary? That's because the pituitary basically has two parts. So you have the posterior pituitary, which is actually pretty directly connected to the hypothalamus, um, and the anterior pituitary, which is connected through the portal system. So if you're interested, the way that the posterior pituitary is connected is via axons. So it's actually just axons that, oh, actually it's the other way. So the axons start in the hypothalamus and they synapse onto the posterior pituitary. Again, if you don't really understand this, neuroscience, like this is really part of the neuroscience chapter. I'll link some videos down in the description. Definitely not super important for this video, though. You don't necessarily have to like pause, look it up, and move on. Not as important as like the depolarization thing, where you have to like look it up. Anyway, so going back to the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary versus a posterior pituitary. Now, what the anterior pituitary does. So anterior pituitary has both glandular and neural tissue. What do I mean by that? So it can do the neural stuff. It does do like normal brain things, right? But it can also, because it has glandular tissue, it can also produce the hormones, which actually the posterior pituitary cannot. So the hormones that the posterior pituitary releases are actually produced elsewhere. As far as the anterior pituitary goes, though, it can produce the hormones, then it stores them until something like a hormone comes along, right? Until like CRH comes along and tells it to release it. So yeah. So now, what is that hormone, right? So that hormone CRH, so the hypothalamus releases a hormone called the corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay. I'm trying to see which words. So we already talked about what hormone is. I feel like most of us know what the word releasing is, but I guess we'll talk about what I mean by that. The word that I really care about is tropin. So tropin, this, if you've read the chapter, should ring a bell. This should look like the word tropic. Now there's two types of hormones, right? Actually, there are multiple types of hormones. But there's two types of hormones as far as like the mechanism of action goes, not really their composition. So as far as the mechanism of action goes, there's tropic and you have direct hormones. So a tropic hormone, now if you're yelling at the screen or fast forwarding me, awesome, I love that. But a tropic hormone is essentially something that it's a hormone that tells another tissue to release a hormone, right? It doesn't directly cause the effect that it needs. So in this case, right, like going up here, CRH at the end of the day wants to induce stress responses. Like it wants you to have Why am I blanking? It wants you to have a higher heart rate. CRH, or the hypothalamus, at the end of the day wants you to have a higher heart rate. It wants you to be in that fight or flight mode, right? So, but it's releasing a hormone, right? That's telling another organ to release a hormone. That's telling another organ to release a hormone. In this case, that's then causing the stress. That's then causing the desired effects, right? In this case, that norepinephrine, right? That thing that's causing the desired effect, the ultimate effect, that is called a direct hormone. But the hormone that's like all the hormones that are like basically telling another thing to do it, like think of it as like middle management, right? Those are called tropic hormones. So that is where this tropin comes from. Then the next part, right, you have cortico, right? So the cortico, what does that mean? Well, it's because the hormone that then gets released, right, the ACTH, so the CRH causes the pituitary to release ACTH. This then acts on the adrenal cortex. So cortico should ring a bell for cortex. So essentially, CRH causes the release, right? The release of a tropic hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex. That's where the name comes from, right? Okay, so now the hypothalamus has released CRH into the portal vein. That stimulated the anterior pituitary to release the next hormone. The next hormone is ACTH. This is the adrenocorticotropin hormone. Okay, so it's finally releasing that corticotropin, right? So the corticotropin releasing hormone causes the release of the corticotropin. You should be able to follow that by now, right? Um, if not, let me know. I haven't done a great job. All the ACTH, all the A here does is it clarifies what cortex we're talking about. Probably just a quirk of the scientific community. Probably one guy discovered it and went, "Oh, let me name it adrenocortico," and another guy was like, "Oh, it's just a corticotropin." That's basically all it is. But yeah, so this is a tropic hormone, right? So this is a tropin that acts on the adrenal cortex. Okay. Now, what is the adrenal cortex? I've been kind of talking about this a little bit, but I haven't really mentioned what that actually is. So, on top of your kidneys, this is a kidney, you have these little things. We have these little glands, and that's the adrenal gland. Right. And the adrenal gland is actually split into two, not half and half, actually. You have like the inside and the outside. The outside, this is the cortex. The inside is the medulla. You can actually remember this by understanding where the word medulla comes from, right? Medulla literally means mid, right? Not mid like that way, but like middle, right? Medulla literally means the middle. So the medulla is going to be in the middle. So cortex, right? The adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids as a result of ACTH. It also releases mineral corticoids. Did I mention? Yep, it also releases mineral corticoids. It also releases aldosterone, but that is not something that I'm going to talk about right now. So, what are these glucocorticoids, right? Now, every time I've mentioned corticoids, you might be thinking of the word corticosteroids, and you'd actually be right. Or you might also be thinking of cortisol, which you would also be right. These glucocorticoids, I like to think of them as like the long stress hormones, and that like this is what's gonna make you feel like generally anxious when you're, when you have like finals coming up or something like that. Not when you see a snake. When you see a snake, that's gonna be your like catecholamines. That's gonna be like um epinephrine and norepinephrine and all that jazz. But when you have, long-term stress, right? Like you have your MCAT coming up in X months, that's going to be the glucocorticoids playing a role, and that's going to be cortisol. The key one that you really have to know as far as MCAT goes is cortisol. Cortisol is in humans, and you might also see the word cortisone. This is that in rodents, so this is just that hormone in rodents. Um, from the name cortisol and cortisone, you might be able to guess that these are steroid hormones, which means, oh, it is the 4th of July, which means that they come from cholesterol, right? Just throwing that out there, I guess. Okay, these glucocorticoids, right? Like they can cause the long stress, but also they can also stimulate the medulla, right? Like they can also stimulate the medulla to release the catecholamines. These catecholamines are the two. Well, you have three main catecholamines, but the two that are like stress hormones are norepinephrine and epinephrine. Um, if this looks familiar, because this is just adrenaline. Epinephrine is just adrenaline, and that's actually what like people inject when, well, that's what's in an EpiPen, right? It's what's injected when you have a inflammatory response, when you have an anaphylactic, when you have an allergic reaction. Oh my God. It's what's injected when you have an allergic reaction. Norepinephrine, um, it has a lot of has a lot of uses in your body, a lot of functions. The big one, I would say, is vigilance. What do I mean by that? It just means that you're able to maintain your attention on something as opposed to like um consistently like moving around. Like it's one way for you to like maintain your attention on a task. It also is a hormone that kind of like allows you to not be drowsy. There's actually a really cool study on this. Back in long time ago, sometime in the 1900s, they thought that norepinephrine was actually the reward hormone because they had mice um, that had norepinephrine blockers. So they put norepinephrine blockers on mice, and they were like, "Oh, they're not doing the task that gives them the reward." But then when they actually watched footage of the like mice um, doing the test, the experiment, um, what they found was when they blocked the norepinephrine, the mice just kind of fell asleep. So they just really were super lethargic. They just didn't have the motivation to do anything. So that's kind of what like norepinephrine does. That was total sidebar. Okay, so that's essentially cortico the the HPA axis. Um, did I cover everything here? Corticosteroids. Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, One more thing. So I did mention that there were three catecholamines really, and the three catecholamines are dopamine. I'm gonna be nice. Dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Now, from this name, you might guess that these are amino acid derived hormones, and these guys come from tyrosine. There's also one more amino acid derived hormone that you should know, and that is serotonin, which is actually not a catecholamine, so I'm going to write it separately. Serotonin, and you might see this as 5-HT if you see me write it later. That is serotonin, and that comes from tryptophan. Cool. All right, I hope this was useful. Let me know if I should change something. This absolutely was not useful. That's totally fine too. Just let me know. This together, I never introduced myself. Hi, my name is Dixie. I took the MCAT about 3 years ago, got a 519, and I've been tutoring it since then. I'm taking a break right now because I'm starting med school, but I really miss tutoring, so I'm making some videos at the moment. I hope these are useful. If not, well, let me know how I can improve. Thanks. Bye.